Under the NEC, one of the key components is making sure the communications are correct. And I think unusually to the NEC, unlike other forms of contract, there's a whole section in the contract about how you communicate in section 13. I guess one of the key questions that most people have when they're using it is how does 13.1, which explains what an effective communication is in writing, works in relation to 13.7 around notifications? What do we think about that? Does it work as having so much information around notifications?
I think it's helpful, firstly, to have a written record of something. It is a record that can be evidenced. It also forces parties to rehearse their views, and once committed to writing and shared with the other side, the parties can sensibly discuss things. And then I think with 13.7, with the separate notices, that's helpful as well, because that addresses one issue at a time. There were days when sort of notifications or claims were coming through hidden away at the bottom of other letters and things like that. So it's what it's driving at for me, which I think is good, is a clear communication that's in writing and it's separate, and each of those issues can then be addressed on their own merits as a one-off item.
Ian, do you think, although it's there in black and white in the form of contract, do you think it's actually operated as intended in the contract?
Often not, I'm afraid. Quite often people don't follow it as they should. You know, particularly notifications, people do think drop them into other letters. Also, the idea is to have each notification separate. So each compensation notification separate to another. Sometimes people roll several together, which in itself is probably not a huge issue as long as it's clear that these are individual issues that need to be addressed separately. So there's a bit of pragmatism you can bring into it, but ultimately you should stick with the rules of the contract for it to work effectively.
Do you think the rules are really as simple as they look?
I think they are, and actually I think that you should go further than each notification. It should be almost each contractual communication should be separate. And if you look at the cloud-based systems, the good ones, they almost force every contractual communication to be a separate communication. Going back to Ewan's point, that means that they are a discrete communication. We can consider them, and they're linked to previous ones. And therefore you can almost isolate a topic or an area of discussion rather than go, well, it was in that letter and half was in that letter, and well, I saw it somewhere, where was it? And you can trace it, so it's all in one place. So I'd almost go further than what the contract says.
I guess it's almost a conceptual change between imagining communications as letters on pieces of paper that we put in an envelope and send in the post to cloud-based systems, electronic systems, which are all automatically tracking where everything is when it arrives, when it's sent. So breaking things down into smaller chunks becomes more viable, but more difficult to manage, isn't it, Ian?
Well, it comes back to this issue around process and administrative burden of the contract, that if you do have lots of communications, they do need a response. You know, cloud-based systems will demand a response. That's going to take time, and it can become cumbersome. So I think you have to, again, have this little degree of pragmatism around, do you need to raise everything? Some things can be a phone call or discussion. You can deal with it. It's matters closed, and there's no need maybe to formally record it. For some things, maybe you do, for the purposes of historical record in case things happen later on. But you wouldn't record every conversation on site or raise some sort of notification unless it had a contractual purpose. So I think you'd have to be a little bit more pragmatic about how you use it.
But building on what Ian said, you don't agree things by writing contractual communications to each other. Agree things by discussing them, whether it's by phone, out on site, in someone else's office, then confirm them and summarise them in writing. That will just reduce the amount of communications going backwards and forwards, but also the size of them.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. People can hide behind these forms of communication to avoid having a discussion, to avoid debating the issue. You know, a standard response back from a project manager of, I need more information before I can make a decision, just to postpone it and put it off, when rather sitting down, having a conversation, that's the way to resolve it, rather than hiding behind the communication system.
But if the NEC is really set up to be a handbook or a play manual, which everyone's supposed to have out on their desk, and you look in the contract each time you have something and it tells you what to do next? Don't you think those softer parts of the communication, the non-written bits of the communication, which I think we all agree are absolutely vital, actually that needs to appear somewhere in the contract so that actually people do it rather than jumping too quickly to the written forms?
Well, it does in two areas. It does actually direct you to have verbal or oral discussions, the risk reduction meeting, and when the project manager has discussions with the contractor about different practical ways of dealing with the compensation event. So it does in two places, but you could say, yes, give it greater prominence.
Both of those places are fairly far down the process, though, aren't they? I mean, whether it's the early warning risk reduction meeting or the discussion on different ways to price a CE, you're already at least halfway through a process before you get to the oral stage. And I think the key for how the NEC works and being proactive is to try and get that conversation earlier, isn't it? Wouldn't you agree, Ewan?
Well, certainly it's interesting that you raised the early risk reduction meeting, early warnings and the risk reduction meeting resulting thereof, because that does actually give a forum, I think, for people to discuss things without, before they're committed formally to writing. I think the NEC has probably got it about right, actually. If you think that the communication that clauses are in the contract, whereas they don't appear in other standard forms, it is leading the way. It is proactive, and how much bite you can get out of not recording communications in the right way, how much contractual bite I'm talking about there, is probably quite hard to drive through to make someone dot the I's, cross the T's, and make sure every communication is in the right form.
So concluding that, then, I think the clauses in 13 are a great step forward from other forms of contract, and at least we've got something there telling us how to communicate, but it's not the whole story. It's part of the story about how you communicate under the NEC, and if you only do what's in clause 13, you probably aren't going to make the most of the use of the NEC, and you will start becoming bogged down in the process rather than achieving what you intended. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.